The storm and the unlikely heroes. The storm came out of nowhere. One minute, the skies over Bay Ridge, Maine, were clear, with only a few wisps of clouds drifting lazily by. The next, dark thunderheads gathered with alarming speed, churning into a violent storm. The coastal town was used to heavy rain, but nothing prepared them for this. Within hours, Bay Ridge's peaceful streets turned into raging rivers, sweeping away everything in their path. Mason Reed, Bay Ridge's veteran K-9 officer, stood in the emergency command center, his eyes fixed on the monitors in front of him. The relentless pounding of rain against the windows was deafening, and the shrill wail of emergency sirens outside seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. Mason's partner, Shadow, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a mind as sharp as his loyalty, stood by his side. The dog's usual calm demeanor had shifted to one of alertness, his body tense as he sensed the chaos unfolding outside. "Get ready, Reed. We need you and Shadow on the front lines." Chief Williams' voice cut through the cacophony of noise. Mason turned his gaze to the map spread out across the table, where red markers indicated the rapidly rising floodwaters. "We've got families trapped in the Eastern District. The waters are rising faster than we thought. The Clearwater Dam's been flagged for repairs, but those budget cuts left it vulnerable." Mason nodded without hesitation. He knew what was at stake. Shadow's training in search and rescue had saved countless lives over the years, earning him legendary status among the town's first responders. Today, that training would be tested like never before. "All right, Chief," Mason replied, pulling on his rain gear. "Shadow and I will head out. We'll get to the hardest-hit areas and find survivors." With the rain now coming down in sheets so thick it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, Mason and Shadow made their way into the storm. The streets, once familiar, were now unrecognizable, transformed into torrents of water that rushed through the town, carrying debris and turning everything in their path into a deadly obstacle. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and the constant roar of rushing water drowned out everything else. As they reached the first cluster of partially submerged apartment buildings, Mason's radio crackled with frantic updates on the worsening conditions. Despite the chaos, Shadow remained focused, his nose working constantly, detecting the faintest traces of human scent beneath the overwhelming smell of the flood. The dog's ears were perked forward as he led the way. "Mason, do you copy?" A voice came through the radio. "There are people trapped in the second-floor units. We need your team to secure the area and get them to safety." "We're on it," Mason responded, moving swiftly through the rising water, Shadow leading him towards the buildings. As they approached the first apartment, Mason called out, his voice barely audible above the roar of the water. "Rescue team, this way." Inside the building, they found 3 families huddled on the second floor, the water already seeping through the floorboards. The elderly woman of the group clutched Shadow's fur with trembling hands as she whispered her thanks. Shadow stood patiently by her side, his calm demeanor providing a small comfort in the chaos. As the hours passed, Mason and Shadow worked tirelessly, moving from building to building, searching for survivors. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and the floodwaters continued to rise. But Shadow, with his extraordinary abilities, never faltered. The partnership between man and dog was a seamless dance. Where technology failed, Shadow's senses cut through the storm. His nose found survivors where high-tech equipment couldn't, and his unwavering loyalty guided them to safety. By nightfall, the storm had only worsened. The Weather Service issued dire warnings about the aging Clearwater Dam upstream. Built in the 1960s, the dam had been flagged for repairs countless times, but years of budget constraints had left it in a vulnerable state. Chief Williams' voice came through Mason's radio again, urgency lacing his words. "Mason, we've received reports of structural issues at the Clearwater Dam. If that dam fails, we could be looking at a catastrophe. All units need to focus on the lower basin neighborhoods immediately." Mason's heart sank. The dam failure was a very real threat, one that could flood entire neighborhoods and cost countless lives. But Shadow was already moving again, his instincts guiding them through the storm, never pausing for rest. Mason could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had seen destruction before, but this storm was unlike anything Bay Ridge had ever experienced. And yet, through it all, Shadow remained the constant, a beacon of hope in the middle of the chaos. As they finished evacuating a young family to an emergency shelter, a call came through that would take them to the heart of the storm. The dispatcher's voice crackled with urgency. "Mason, we've got reports of at least 4 people unaccounted for in the old mill complex. Last communication suggested they were heading to the roof, but we've lost contact." Mason glanced at Shadow, who stood at his side, ears perked and ready for the next challenge. Despite the hours of grueling work, the dog's focus never wavered. "We're on our way," Mason replied, already moving towards their boat. The old mill complex, an abandoned textile mill on the outskirts of town, stood like a dark sentinel at the edge of the swelling floodwaters. They would have to navigate debris-filled water to get there. But Mason trusted Shadow with his life, and he knew that together, they could overcome whatever the storm threw their way. As they made their way through the flooded streets, Mason couldn't help but think of his ex-wife, Vanessa, and their daughter Emma. They had been evacuated to higher ground earlier that day. Mason's dedication to the job had often driven a wedge between them, and their marriage hadn't survived the stress and danger of his work. But as the waters rose and the storm threatened to engulf the town, Mason couldn't help but wonder if Vanessa might finally understand the sacrifices he had made. Then, Shadow's bark broke through Mason's thoughts. The dog was standing at the bow of the boat, focused on the mill ahead, his ears flat against his head. Something was out there, something that only Shadow could sense. As the boat neared the mill, Mason's radio crackled again. "Mason, the dam's failing. All units evacuate to higher ground immediately." Mason looked toward the mill, where people were waiting for rescue, and then back toward the approaching wall of water. There wasn't time for both, but he knew what he had to do. Shadow whined softly, sensing his partner's distress. They had to try. "We can make it," Mason muttered, pushing the boat's motor to full power. But as they reached the mill, the first surge of water hit with violent force, rocking the boat and sending waves crashing over them. Without hesitation, Mason secured the boat and helped Shadow leap onto a fire escape. The dog, understanding the urgency, immediately began climbing. But the water was rising fast, and a second, more powerful surge hit the building with a terrible roar. The structure groaned under the weight of the water, and as Mason climbed after Shadow, the unthinkable happened. The floor beneath them tilted, and in an instant, Shadow was swept into the current. Mason. The scream tore through the chaos as the dog disappeared into the raging floodwaters below. The struggle for survival. The violent surge of water shook the old mill building to its very foundations, sending Mason scrambling as the entire structure groaned under the force of the flood. Shadow, his faithful partner, had been swept away in an instant, disappearing into the chaotic current below. For a moment, Mason stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, his ears ringing with the sound of the roaring waters that had claimed his partner. His body trembled, his mind struggling to process the sight. The dog, the one who had been his unwavering companion for years, was gone. Shadow. Mason's voice cracked as he screamed, his throat tight with desperation. He wouldn't believe it. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to end. They had faced countless dangers together, always side by side. And now Shadow had been lost to the flood. The building shuddered again, and Mason knew that he couldn't waste any more time. The lives of the people on the roof depended on him. He turned away from the raging waters below and forced himself to focus on the task at hand. There was no time to mourn, not now. The storm was still wreaking havoc, and every minute was precious. The 4 missing people, Two elderly men and a young couple huddled on the roof, their faces pale with fear as they clung to the chimney stack for stability. They hadn't seen what had just happened, hadn't witnessed the loss Mason had just suffered. To them, Mason was still the lifeline, the one who would get them out of this nightmare. Mason climbed the final few steps to the roof, his boots slipping on the wet metal, but his resolve never wavering. When he reached the top, he saw the group waiting for him, their eyes lighting up with relief at his arrival. They were safe for now. But what about Shadow? His heart clenched at the thought. "You're safe now," Mason said, his voice steady, though his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He radioed for the Coast Guard to send a helicopter to evacuate the survivors, but his eyes never left the stormy waters below, searching for any sign of his partner. But there was nothing. Just the darkness, the relentless rain, and the churning currents. As the helicopter appeared overhead and began lowering a rescue basket, Mason's thoughts continued to race. Shadow had always been there. The dog had been a beacon of courage, the one who never hesitated, never faltered. And now he was gone. Or was he? A small flicker of hope ignited in Mason's chest. Shadow wasn't the type to give up. Not ever. "Your dog?" one of the rescued men asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. "Is he coming too?" Mason could only nod, the lump in his throat too large to speak. "He's the best partner I've ever had," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. The man nodded, understanding the weight of the words. To Mason, Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was family. And right now, his partner was somewhere out there, lost in the storm. As the helicopter returned to the emergency shelter with the survivors, Mason remained on the roof, his eyes scanning the water below. The storm had not let up. The winds howled, and the rain continued to fall in sheets. The Clearwater Dam breach had caused more devastation, but in Mason's mind, there was only one thing that mattered right now: finding Shadow. Hours passed, and Mason returned to the command center, soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his body. His face was grim, his shoulders slumped from exhaustion, but his resolve remained unshaken. Chief Williams looked up from the maps and the flood reports as Mason entered. "Read," the chief said quietly, his voice heavy with sympathy. "I'm sorry about Shadow." Mason didn't respond at first. Instead, he walked over to a table and threw down his drenched gear. The storm raged outside, but the shelter was quiet, filled with the sounds of people trying to recover, trying to rebuild. But Mason couldn't stop thinking about the dog. He couldn't forget the way Shadow's fur had felt against his hand, the way they had worked together to save so many lives. "Protocol says we can't spare resources to search for him," Chief Williams continued, his eyes filled with the weight of the decision. "We need every unit focused on evacuation and rescue. The floodwaters are still rising, and there are more lives at risk." Mason shook his head. He had heard all of this before. The orders, the protocol. But none of it mattered. Shadow had been more than just a partner. He was the one who had always been there when it counted. He couldn't abandon him now. "I understand," Mason said, his voice quiet but determined. He turned away from the chief, his eyes focused on the storm outside. "But I'm going back out there." Chief Williams didn't argue. He had known Mason long enough to know that once the man made up his mind, there was no changing it. But the chief's expression hardened, and he placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. "I understand. Read. Just be careful." Mason grabbed his gear again, this time with a new purpose. He didn't care about the rules. He didn't care about the protocol. All that mattered was finding Shadow. He knew his partner. He knew that Shadow wouldn't give up, wouldn't stop fighting. The dog had survived countless dangerous situations, and Mason knew this wasn't the end. Back at the flooded Public Works building, Mason stood in front of the maintenance maps of Bay Ridge's underground drainage system. Frank Dawson, the aging maintenance supervisor, looked skeptical but reluctantly pointed to a section of the map. "You're crazy," Frank muttered, shaking his head. Those tunnels are completely flooded by now. Even if your dog survived the surge, those tunnels are a maze. He could be anywhere. Mason studied the map, his mind already calculating the most likely path. He had to believe Shadow was still alive. He couldn't, and wouldn't, give up. With a determined nod, Mason grabbed his equipment, including a waterproof headlamp and a specialized locator device. "I know Shadow," he said, his voice unwavering. "I can feel it. He's alive." Frank muttered something under his breath, but Mason didn't hear it. His focus was on one thing: the tunnels. The last place he had seen Shadow. The last hope for finding his partner. As Mason descended into the flooded maintenance shaft, the cold water rushing past him felt like the world closing in. But he ignored the fear, ignored the exhaustion, and pressed on. Shadow was out there somewhere, and he was going to find him. Meanwhile, in the depths of the flooded tunnels, Shadow struggled against the current. His service vest, once a lifeline during rescues, now weighed him down, waterlogged and heavy. His injured leg throbbed with every movement. But still, Shadow pressed on. A sharp pain shot through his right hind leg as it struck something solid underwater, but Shadow fought to stay afloat. His training kicked in. Paddle with the current, not against it. He focused on the task at hand, using every ounce of his strength to keep his head above the water. And then, as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, something unexpected happened. A small, wiry dog emerged from the shadows of the tunnel, eyes keen and alert, seeming to understand Shadow's plight. The two dogs assessed each other with cautious curiosity, but in that moment, Shadow knew he wasn't alone. The stray, though a mere shadow of his former self, was now a companion, guiding him through the tunnel's treacherous paths. The stray nudged Shadow's shoulder gently, urging him forward. Together, the two dogs continued their slow but steady climb, each step a battle against the rising waters. The stray, with its street-smart instincts, led the way, while Shadow, driven by loyalty and determination, followed. Somehow, they were surviving together. The reunion and the power of never giving up. The storm that had once ravaged Bay Ridge now seemed to have exhausted itself, but the damage was far from over. The town lay in ruins, its streets flooded and buildings in shambles, yet there was still hope. And in the midst of it all, Mason Reed's search continued. He pushed forward through the murky waters of the tunnel, his heart set on one thing: finding Shadow. He had to find him. The thought of leaving his partner behind, of losing the one being who had always been there for him, was unbearable. For hours, Mason trekked through the flooded tunnels, his flashlight cutting through the dark, murky water. His legs were heavy with fatigue, and the cold seeped into his bones, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Shadow's life was still at stake. The sound of rushing water was deafening, but beneath it, Mason's ears strained for any hint of movement, any bark, any sign that his dog was still out there. He didn't know it yet, but Shadow wasn't alone anymore. Deep within the winding tunnels, Shadow, battered and injured, was still pushing forward, his body exhausted but driven by a single thought: find Mason. The stray had become his unlikely guide through the labyrinth of underground passages. Though the stray wasn't a trained rescue dog, it had a street-smart knowledge of the tunnels, a survival instinct that kept them moving forward. The two dogs moved in tandem, each step slower than the last as the water continued to rise. Shadow's leg, already injured, screamed with pain, but the stray nudged him gently, urging him to keep going. It was a simple gesture, but to Shadow, it was everything. They were a team, just like he and Mason had been for so long. Despite the pain, Shadow's determination didn't waver. He knew he had to keep going, for Mason. The stray's presence gave him strength, an unexpected ally in the face of overwhelming odds. Together, they fought the current, moving toward higher ground, each step a battle against the flood, each breath a reminder of the bond they shared. Mason reached the junction in the tunnels where the water was deepest, and for a moment, He felt his heart sink. The path ahead looked impossible. But then, just as his resolve began to falter, he heard it, a faint, familiar sound, barely audible above the roar of the current. It was a bark. Mason. The word barely escaped his lips as he turned in the direction of the sound. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could it really be Shadow? Mason's instincts kicked in. He followed the sound of the bark, pushing through the rising water, his feet slipping on the wet concrete, his breath coming in short gasps. The deeper he went, the louder the bark became. He was getting closer. And then, as if guided by some unseen force, Mason rounded a corner. And there, in the dim light of his flashlight, he saw him. Shadow. The sight stopped him in his tracks. The dog was standing at the edge of a narrow walkway, his fur soaked, his body battered. But his eyes were as bright as ever. Shadow was alive. And despite the odds, he had found a way to survive. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved. They simply stared at each other, both overwhelmed by the emotions that surged in that brief, beautiful silence. Mason's heart was pounding in his chest, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from sheer relief, joy, and disbelief. His partner, his best friend, had made it. Shadow. Mason's voice cracked as he rushed toward the dog. Shadow's tail gave a weak wag as he limped toward Mason, his paws slipping on the waterlogged ground. When Mason reached him, he dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around his partner. "I knew you were alive. I knew it." Shadow nuzzled Mason's face, his way of saying, "I'm here." They had been through so much together, and now, against all odds, they were reunited. Mason carefully checked Shadow's injuries, relieved to see that despite the exhaustion and the cuts, the dog was alive, and his spirit was unbroken. He whispered softly to Shadow, his voice full of gratitude. "You're a hero. You know that. You've always been a hero." The stray, who had stayed close by, watched them with intelligent eyes. It was clear that, in some way, the stray had known how to help Shadow when he needed it most. It had guided him when the flood had threatened to swallow him whole. Mason looked at the stray, gratitude filling his heart for the unexpected friend who had stepped in when Shadow needed help the most. With the storm finally subsiding, Mason knew there was still much work to be done. He had to get Shadow out of the tunnels and back to safety. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. He had found his partner, his family, and together, they had made it through the worst. Hours later, Mason and Shadow emerged from the tunnels, both drenched but alive. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a landscape forever changed by the flood. But for Mason and Shadow, the real battle had already been won. They had survived, and they had done it together. As they made their way to the emergency command center, Chief Williams approached them, his eyes widening in disbelief at the sight of Shadow standing beside Mason. "I can't believe it," the chief said, his voice filled with awe. "I thought we lost him." Mason smiled, his heart full. "Shadow doesn't give up. Neither do I." It was a simple truth, but one that had carried them through the darkest hours of the storm. The bond between Mason and Shadow was unbreakable, forged through years of trust, loyalty, and shared experience. They had been through hell and back, and now they were more than just a K-9 team. They were family. As the recovery efforts continued and the town began to rebuild, Mason couldn't help but think of everything they had faced together. The storm had tested them, but it had also reminded him of the power of resilience, the strength of loyalty, and the unwavering belief that no matter how dark things seemed, there was always a way through. "Never give up," Mason whispered, glancing down at Shadow, who stood proudly at his side. "Not now. Not ever." And as they walked together through the flooded streets of Bay Ridge, Mason knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he and Shadow would face them together. They had already conquered the impossible, and with that, anything was possible. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.